Uisle agus a cháirde, bhaile an fáilteas féad de chorúid tróna ag an ócáid íontach cultúrga atá agan tróna. Chuige sé bliain ó hen tháinig John Behan thugaine gon chéadúr le taspántas, níideag seascaní, agus is íontach agus is álan an rud é go bhfuil sé arás in ar measc arís le bhailiúcháin íontach nua go dealabhóracht gon chéad sculpt. It's 56 years ago since we first had a John Behan exhibition, and I said we're very, very proud to have him back with us again, producing new work, extraordinary new work in this wonderful, wonderful exhibition. Always a pleasure to work with John and to show his work. And always a pleasure also, I have to say, to welcome our guest speaker this evening. You've heard me before saying many times, always ask a poet to open an exhibition, because they have a kind of a vision. They can see in around the back of the picture and talk about the genesis of the work and where it came from and so on. And so we're very privileged, I have to say this evening, to have with us an extraordinary poet and creative writer, and that is Louis de Paor. So could we find
It's a great honour and a great privilege to be asked to speak at the launch of a marvellous new exhibition by, I suppose we could call John Ireland's national sculptor. We're celebrating here not just extraordinary new work, but a lifetime of achievement at the very highest level. And so many writers have spoken and written so well about John's work over the years that I thought I might recycle some of what they've said over the years about his work. And I think that's not inappropriate to this particular occasion, because there is an extraordinary degree of continuity over time that's at the centre of John's work. One of his great strengths, I think, is the ability to circle back repeatedly to images that have sustained him throughout his working life without ever being exhausted of their ability to square up to reality. There are central images, bulls and boats in particular, material from Táin Bó Cúailnge, and each time John revisits those central images in his work, there's a sense in which he's testing the images themselves to see, are they capable of responding to the latest changes in human history? Are they capable of responding to more recent traumas, since so much of his imagery derives from the historical aspect of the traumatic Irish colonial experience? And again, it's clear that not only are the images up to confronting the world, taking at least some of the weight of the world on themselves, but quite clearly John continues to be able to do that. So that these images change their meanings, they deepen their resonance over time. And therefore, I think what the writers I'm going to refer to now have said about his work, going back maybe 50 years in one instance, applies as much to this exhibition, because there's a deepening of meaning and an accumulation of meaning over time. Brian Friel, writing about John's early work, describes the material as four square on the earth, executed to the point of absolute completeness. I mean, it's an extraordinary half sentence, isn't it, that encapsulates so much. But here, as throughout all of John's work, what you're first struck by is the materiality, the solidity of the images themselves, of the sculptures, the heft of the made object. In terms of execution, clearly there is a sense of equilibrium and proportion in all of John's work that adds to the appeal that they have, and adds also to the meaning, I think, that they have, and I'll come back to that a bit later. But to go back to what Friel says again, the idea of process here, something that is executed to the point of absolute completeness. One of the great things here today is we have some of the drawings that are a kind of a prelude, if you like, to the commitment to forging in bronze these images that are derived directly from the confrontation between the imagination of the artist and the traumatic reality of this particularly difficult moment in world history. So there's a process there, we know, because people have written about it extensively, that John brings notebooks with him everywhere. So those notebooks are a kind of a shorthand that record his immediate visual and sensory responses to the out there real world. We can see in these drawings then how there's another phase in the process, another development here, where there's a clarifying of those particular images, and then in the end, like I said, there's the commitment, the principal commitment for a sculptor to forging in metal objects, material objects, that actually then are returned to the world as objects in the world. It's a great advantage the sculpture, I think, has over music and poetry and other forms, that eventually made objects find their way back into the real world, closing the circuit between reality and artistic imagination. I think when Friel talks about completeness, we can also talk about, again, that idea that is central to John's work, the constant reworking of a cluster of primary images that are capable, and more than capable, under the pressure of his own imagination, capable of responding to the pressure of both history and imagination. That's an extraordinary achievement, I think, because history is unstable and doesn't settle long enough, if you like, and yet at all stages these images have been capable of responding to trauma for the most part, I think. It's hardly controversial to say that the repertoire of images associated with John Behan's work are drawn principally from, but not restricted to, Irish history, literature and mythology. Fred Johnston has written beautifully about John's work, and he refers to that repertoire of images as a language of icons that have become part of the clay of our common making. I think that's an extraordinary thing, that John has contributed something to our own sense of engagement with the world through art. Seamus Heaney, I think, is on the same track when he says that John's work has now become a part of our mental furniture, a psychic bedrock that grounds our collective imagination. I think both Fred and Seamus are onto something fundamental and extraordinary there, because it is, after all, an extraordinary claim, justified, however, by the present exhibition and a lifetime of hard labour, that an individual artist has succeeded in articulating an aspect of our collective subconscious. I think it's what all artists aspire to, that by accessing that psychic bedrock that Seamus talks about, that there is an aspect of our collective unconscious or subconscious there that is brought to the level of consciousness in a way that absolutely ameliorates some of the more traumatic aspects of our human existence. I think that John has managed to do that is all the more remarkable, given the extent to which much of that psychic bedrock that Seamus refers to is the bedrock of a pre-colonial Gaelic Irish imaginary that was still buried under the rubble of colonialism, imperialism and revolution in the period when John and the remarkable generation of artists to which he belongs emerged in the middle decades of the 20th century. These elements that are now part of our collective imagination, as Seamus has it, they were not a given in our culture. Cultures that have a great deal, that have an unbroken continuity between the ancient world and the contemporary world are very fortunate. You know, the Greeks have it, anything derived from classical civilization, there's a pattern of continuity there. But the boats and the bulls, the material from Táin Bó Cúailnge and all the rest of it, this stuff was buried away for hundreds of years until during the revival period, and then right into the middle decades of the 20th century, an active retrieval, recuperation of that material took place, with several generations of artists working in a number of different mediums were involved. I think we're talking therefore about a willed, creative act of unforgetting. Okay, much of what John has recuperated belongs to the more traumatic aspects of our collective history, and these things were suppressed to a great degree. Clearly the famine is the most obvious example of that. So to retrieve those images is an extraordinary achievement, and to make them adaptable, to more contemporary traumas is even more remarkable. Adrian Fraser has talked about some of John's larger historical sculptures as works of massive public restitution. Seamus Heaney talks about the redress of poetry. In both cases, there's a sense of somehow making amends, somehow repairing the damage done by history. And I think the material we're looking at here is a part of that. But what's even more remarkable is that John has gone beyond the Irish historical context here. By confronting the brute realities of Irish colonial history, he has created a visual vocabulary that speaks to human suffering in very different historical, geographical and cultural contexts. I think that's the most extraordinary aspect of this particular exhibition. You have the crucifixion of Christ in the corner here, you have a Holocaust survivor here, and then the preeminent element, if you like, of this exhibition is the suffering, the contemporary suffering of people in Gaza. But we are being reminded of the universality of human suffering, the idea that an artist who has delved and excavated so deeply in traumatic Irish historical colonial memory is now able to harness the images that derive from that to speak to the contemporary crisis, I think is absolutely extraordinary. To go to what John himself has to say about his own approach to art, he says, the historicity of these things is undeniable and unforgettable. Whether it's the crucifixion, whether it's the famine, whether it's the Holocaust or Gaza, they're undeniable and unforgettable. And then he says, I'm part of that. I should not be trying to get away from it, but try to confront it. We are reminded in this work and in all of John's work, I think, of a sense of responsibility to both past and present, the need for an art that is capable of measuring up to the world, as John has done in this exhibition. Elsewhere he says, I feel that every artist must have roots that will tap into the ground. He talks about the gulf between the Middle Ages and the 20th century in terms of visual art history in Ireland. So he says, I had to go back. The future was in the past, if you like. Art must have a basis. If it takes it from other cultures, that's fine. If it takes it from its own culture, that's also fine. So what we're looking at here is a bringing together of those two elements. But I'm really taken with the idea that the future is the past. The quickest way to the future is through the past. And I'm reminded that this is a project that's been going on, a project of reclamation that's been going on for 150 years or thereabouts. That before John and his generation emerged, writers and artists during the first 20 years of the 20th century, a glorious time in all kinds of ways in Ireland, other people were involved in the same kind of excavation. In 1904, Padraig Pearse said, a country which cuts itself off from its past cuts itself off from its sources of inspiration and can from that moment forward merely imitate. I think that's very close to what John is talking about almost a century later. Pearse, at the same time, is not somebody who insists that nativism is the approach. His idea is that what we want is a new conversation between Ireland, Europe and the world. One of his most famous formulae for the emergence of new art in Ireland says two influences go into the making of every artist apart, that is, from his own personality, if indeed personality is not in the main only the sum of these influences. The influence of his ancestors and that of his contemporaries. He's talking about literature, but it could be art as well. Irish literature, he says, if it is to live and grow, must get into contact on the one hand with its own past and on the other with the mind of contemporary Europe. The interesting thing there is contemporary Europe is easy for Pearse and his generation, right? Because of the imperial education system, France is not mysterious to them. It's their own past is mysterious to them and clearly continued to be not immediately accessible and easily available to John's generation. I'm going to develop this a little bit further. It seems like a cul-de-sac, but it actually isn't, because Pearse, in his estimation of the ability of individual artists, is almost never wrong, and he's a huge interest in visual art. He identifies the emergence of a new school of Irish sculpture in the first decade of the 20th century, and he identifies it particularly with Dublin. One of the great questions for revivalists is, well, it's all very well that we have the Abbey, we have theatre, what about the visual arts? And he argues that, having seen an Oireachtas exhibition in 1906, the sculptures are ahead of everyone else, and it's a Dublin cohort of sculptors. He'd have been biased, of course, because of his own family involvement there, but here's what he says. That there's already an Irish school of sculpture, this is 1906, remember. No one who walks through these rooms can deny It's not merely that Irish subjects are being treated. That's altogether a minor point. But that an Irish mode of expression in sculpture is being evolved. In other words, there is springing up in Ireland, chiefly in Dublin, a group of young sculptors which, while embracing many diverse and strongly marked individualities, nevertheless holds in common certain traditions of outlook and method which differentiate it as strongly on the one hand from South Kensington with its cold and uninspiring creed of formalism, as on the other from the mixture of impressionism and exaggerated realism which marks the incipient decline of French sculpture. He might have been a little previous there, but there you go. What I'm interested in is where he ends up. He says, the Irish school will have originality without eccentricity, vigour with nevertheless a due sense of reserve. I think he could have been talking about Seamus Murphy, and I think he could have been talking about John Behan. Originality without eccentricity, vigour with a due sense of reserve. And finally, to bring the two things together in terms of the political commitment, and I'll talk more about the present exhibition before I conclude. Pearce in 1913 says, here is a matter in which I cannot remain neutral. My instinct is with the landless man against the lord of lands, and with the breadless man against the master of millions. I think that's a useful entry point into this present exhibition. I think the idea of bearing witness to human suffering, the idea of art as a form of redress and restitution is at the heart of A Terrible Beauty, which is the perfect title for this exhibition, I think. The juxtaposition of Gaza, Calvary and the Holocaust are reminders, I've said already, of the universality of human suffering and the inhumanity of human brutality. There is a real challenge here, however, clearly flagged, I think, in Yeats's formulation and the title of this exhibition. How does art respond to human atrocity without assuaging the horror? We believe in the redemptive power of art, but sometimes it's too easy, and it assuages us and it allows us a kind of a trapdoor out of the real and away from responsibility. In many of the images in this exhibition, we find life reduced to the barest of bare essentials. Even the goats and the bulls here seem more skeletal, I think, than previously. There's a kind of primordial sparseness here. Human figures simplified to the most rudimentary outlines, the unadorned scaffolding of human life. What we find here, particularly in the images from Gaza, is not, however, the horror of the war photographer's work. That's absolutely necessary, I think. But we have a different kind of testimony here, I think, no less necessary. Everywhere you look here, there are signs of deep, deep distress. It's not that the impact of horror and atrocity and inhumanity is not there. It's reflected everywhere here to us. But it's there side by side with the most extraordinary dignity, and I think it's the dynamic tension between the distress and the dignity that makes this an extraordinary exhibition, and each of these pieces so compelling. The distress and dignity are there in equal measure in Van Gogh's boots, in images of the famine. It's there in the figure of Cuchulainn, in the figure of Christ, in the Holocaust survivor, and above all else in the people of Gaza. If art tends towards the possibility of human redemption, as I think it does, John Behan's work is a reminder that responsibility is a prerequisite for such redemption, that ethics and aesthetics must align, as they do in Yeats's phrase that so eloquently gives its title to this wonderful exhibition. To conclude with what John himself says, to revert to what I mentioned from his own words earlier, he said, the historicity of these things, everything from the famine to Gaza, back to the crucified Christ and the figure of Cuchulainn at the moment of his death. The historicity of these things is undeniable and unforgettable. I'm part of it. I should not be trying to get away from it, but try to confront it. I am too concerned with fact, which I have to deal with, that I think we all have to deal with. This is as much a summons to responsibility as it is a holding out of the possibility ultimately of some kind of human redemption. Ní fanta dibra chréaslú le John agus ar ágúil sé seo seolta go hifigiúid. Gur míle maith.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the exhibition. It's been a tough year's work with all that's going on, as we know, in the world. But I was very committed, and I hope that commitment shows through in the work. But I want to dedicate the exhibition today, and I'm glad to see the family here, of my great and dear friend Bert McCormick, who was an inspiration to me always as a person of great integrity. Welcome. There's a quotation, and it's from Albert Camus. It may not be absolutely accurate, but it was my platform, if you like, that I took up for this exhibition. He said, there is no philosophy that's worth the shedding of one drop of blood from a child. And I firmly believe in that. Yeah. And when you get a noble person like Camus saying that, it sticks, it's meaningful. And with all the lies that are going around the world today, it's good to go back to people like Camus and realise that there is hope in the world with people such as he. Anyway, I won't go any further. Louis made a magnificent summarisation of this exhibition today, and I thank him from the bottom of my heart. Now, all I can say is once more, welcome, and I hope you can get something from this exhibition that may sustain both your thoughts and your feelings. So welcome to the exhibition. Thank you very much for being here.
Always ask a poet to open an exhibition. I just want to say thank you, Louis. That was an extraordinary speech. Wonderful. And can I just say that you're welcome to come back to this. It's hard to see all of the sculpture with such a crowd today. And Monday morning we'll move some of them out so that you can walk around them all. It is well worth coming back, and the show is going to be here for a month. So, for the Míle Maithí, thank you for your attention.